Thank you. We'll go ahead and now move on to our final speaker today. I'll excuse you guys. So thank you very much. They did a great job. Let's give them another round of applause. Everybody knows Dr. Tom Lenz. He's been a lifelong advocate for health and welfare of the horse. He's chaired American Association of Equine Practitioners Welfare Committee. He served on the American Veterinary Medical Association's Welfare Committee. He serves on Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association's Animal Welfare Committee. He is a trustee of the American Horse Council and immediate past chair of the Unwanted Horse Coalition, and he's also the past president of AAEP. I think you'll enjoy today's talk by Dr. Lenz. It provides some great insight to our society and the way that we conduct our business. So let's welcome Dr. Tom Lenz.
Thank you, Ward. Thank you. We're going to spend about the next 35, 40 minutes or so talking about lessons that we've learned on welfare in dealing with the unwanted horse. You know, in the past, we've had a lot of welfare issues that we've dealt with across the industry, but we've always worked on them and resolved them within the industry. The unwanted horse was the first time that we had to deal with the public and the federal government and state governments and animal activists and some other segments of the horse industry that violently disagreed with some of the things that we were pushing or things that we believed. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned during that experience, and I want to give you a little advice, my personal advice on how I think we should handle welfare issues in the future. So we need to kick that back a little bit. There we go. I think this is summed up pretty well by Dean Osborne at the University of California, Davis, where he says, animal welfare is fast becoming the major challenge of the veterinary profession. And it's just not the challenge of the veterinary profession, it's the challenge of the agriculture industry and the horse industry. And why is that? It's because we're losing our voice as the voice of authority for animal welfare. And here's a survey that was conducted by the Center for Food Integrity that asks, who's the most credible source of information on farm animal care? And according to consumers, housewives, the Humane Society of the United States was #1, veterinarians and PETA were tied for second, and farmers and ranchers were a distant third. Now, I'm sure if that survey was taken 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, it would have been dramatically different. And so we're losing our voice as the voice authority for animal care, and it's important that we start to do something about that. And this issue is not going to go away. Here's a survey run by USA Today that asks 5th graders, what's the most important issues in the world? Welfare of animals was #1, protecting the environment was #2, and caring for people was #3. And so this is going to continue to be an issue at least throughout the rest of our lifetime. So we're pretty smart people. How tough can it really be to make recommendations on horse welfare? Well, if you look at the walking horse industry, and 40 years ago when I graduated from veterinary school and they started the DQP program, we thought we had in place solutions to stop the soring of horses. And yet that continues today, and even some of their largest show, including the Celebration, their World Show, has been canceled a time or two in recent years because when USDA veterinarians show up to inspect the horses, the trainers load them up and leave the fairgrounds because the horses are sored. If you look at rodeo, that has the strictest welfare regulations of probably any horse competition, where the injury rate based on animal exposures or animal runs, so in this situation the exposure would be 1. Team roping, the exposure would be 3 because there's 2 horses and 1 steer. The injury rate is 0.0036%. And yet at every major rodeo around the country, you'll see activists and oftentimes the folks in City Hall that are trying to shut down rodeo in that city because they're considered inhumane. Carriage horses have some of the strictest regulations on under what temperatures they can work, humidity, how they're housed, how they're fed, how long they can work, what veterinary care they receive. and yet in most major cities in the country, there's a movement to ban carriage horses. Racing. A survey was run recently by a Gallup poll that showed that 40% of the American public is opposed to animal competition, which includes horse racing. And so you'll often see, especially around the Triple Crown time, where there will be movement to outlaw horse racing around the country. So let's talk about definitions of welfare. Welfare is satisfying an animal's needs. You can have good welfare or bad welfare, and good welfare meets 3 criteria. It satisfies their physiological needs or function, that they're well cared for, they have good nutrition, they're healthy, they live in a suitable environment. It meets their safety needs or their feelings that they're protected from injury or abuse. Their psychological needs are able to exercise species-typical behavior, which in the case of a horse means they need to be able to get out around other horses, spend some time outside on grass. So let's talk a little bit about the unwanted horse issue, and then we're going to go into some of the lessons that we've learned. If you remember, this started back in 2000 where there's a bovine spongiform encephalitis outbreak in Europe, followed closely by a hoof and mouth disease outbreak in Great Britain, which increased the consumption of horse meat in Europe. They've always eaten horse meat in Europe. They don't in English-speaking countries usually, but they always have in Europe. And because they felt that beef was unsafe, it increased their consumption of horse meat. And when that happened, it drew the attention of the American media. And when they went over there and saw that they were in fact processing more horses for meat, they wondered, do we process and eat horses in the United States? And when they came back here and investigated, what they found is that we don't, as a rule, eat horses, but we do process them for meat, and we ship that meat around the world. When they published that in magazines and newspapers around the country, there was a huge outroar by the American public, which stimulated the introduction of legislation at the federal level to ban the processing of horses for meat. So this is a really complicated issue. It's one of the few issues in my life that the more you know about it, the more difficult the solution becomes. I've been to a couple of welfare meetings with small animal veterinarians who know very little about this issue, but immediately have a dozen different ways that we can solve it. Well, it's very, very complicated, and it's complicated by a lot of things. One is whether or not you consider horses livestock or companion animals. Most of the industry considers horses livestock, not because we don't like them, but because as long as they remain livestock, there's federal and state funding for equine research, for health disease management and control. The minute that they become companion animals, that funding goes away. But yet, there's a pretty large segment of the horse industry, and certainly the American public, that views horses as pets or companion animals. It's complicated by whether or not you think horses should be eaten. It's complicated by aggressive campaigns from animal activists. Whenever something like this comes up, it gives them the opportunity to push their agenda, to raise money, and to affect lobbyists in Washington, D.C., as well as the American public. It's complicated by the fact that as the American population has gone up, the blue line on the top, the number of people living on ranches and farms has gone down. And the result is the average American is 3 or 4 generations off the ranch or farm, and they don't understand large animal husbandry. They don't understand how they're cared for. And I'll give you a good example. This is a picture of one of my cows. Now last summer, my grandson, who's 9 and lives in town, lives in Kansas City, and I were walking across the pasture going fishing. And as we're walking across the pasture, Tate turns to me and he says, "Grandpa, why are you selling all your cows?" And I said, I'm not selling any of my cows. Why do you think I'm selling my cows? And he said, well, they all have price tags in their ears. Well, that would not occur to me in 1,000 years. But when you look at it from his perspective, that made a lot of sense, that those looked like price tags and I was trying to sell them. Here's a quote from the Kankakee Daily Journal in Illinois. And you can read the highlight. It says, to all you hunters who kill animals for food, shame on you. you ought to go to the store and buy the meat that was made there where no animals were harmed. And you have to assume this was an adult that wrote this and that they really believed that. And I think you'd be surprised, unless you process your own meat, that a lot of people don't realize that hamburgers come from cattle. It's also complicated by the fact that the American public loves horses. Even if they've never touched a horse, if they've never been within 100 yards of a horse, they love horses and they want a voice in how we care for our horses. So why do you think that is? The American public wants a voice at the table on how we treat our horses, because their heroes have always been horses and their heroes have always ridden horses. And because of that, we have to pay attention to what they think. So let's talk just a little bit about the unwanted horse. Unwanted horses are horses that are no longer wanted by their current owner because they're old, injured, sick, unmanageable, or fail to meet their owner's expectations. Generally, they're old horses or horses that are incurably lame. They're horses that are ill-mannered or dangerous. Unadopted feral horses, BLM horses, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. Horses that fail to meet their owner's expectations because they're not very pretty, or they don't jump high enough, or they don't run fast enough, or they don't win ribbons, or they're the wrong color, or they don't have any color in some breeds. But if you go to a packing plant, you go to a horse processing plant, and I've been to them along with Dr. Doug Corey here in the States before they were closed, and in Canada and Mexico. We've been to all of them. You can look out on the lot and you can pick out the old ones and the lame ones, and you can tell the spooky ones because they're skittish and run across the other side of the corral. But 95% of the horses just look like a horse. They look like your horse or my horse. And so you wonder how these horses reach a point in life where they're worth $180, $200 and they're about to be processed. Some of the contributing factors, we ran a survey back in 2010. We had about 27,000 people responded to the survey. Asked them what are the contributing factors, and these are not necessarily in the order that they listed, but the downturn in the economy, and you can look at the top graph. The top graph are breed registration numbers over the last 40, 50 years, and I know many of you remember back in the mid-'80s we went through a depression in the horse industry when they changed the tax code. And if you look down below, and that's the horse processing numbers, it's kind of inversely proportionate. As breeding goes down, processing numbers go up for a time as horses are being removed from the general population. And then as that number goes down, eventually we recover and the industry starts back up. We peaked at about 350,000 horses in 1990, which was about 5 years after the change in the tax code. We've kind of leveled off right now at about 40, 50, 60,000 horses a year that are being exported to Mexico and Canada for processing. Closing of the plants was one. High cost of euthanasia. According to the survey, it costs on average about $400 to euthanize a horse and dispose of the carcass, and most of that charge is disposing of the carcass. Only about $380 or only about $75 to $100 is the actual euthanasia. And then indiscriminate breeding. When times are good in the horse industry, we breed a lot of horses probably that we shouldn't be breeding, and the result is those horses end up in being processed because they don't meet our needs. Number-wise, it's hard to get a number, but we know, looking at the BLM horses, there are about 16,000 BLM horses in the pipeline. When they capture these horses, if they're over the age of 5 years of age, or if they've been put up for adoption 3 times and are not adopted, they're put into long-term sanctuaries and on ranches in Kansas and Oklahoma and several other western-type states where the federal government pays ranchers somewhere between $475 and $500 a year to feed these horses until they die of old age. The average horse in the wild will live to be about 12 or 15 years old. Average horses in these sanctuaries will live up into their mid-20s, just like our horses do. We spend about $43 million a year caring for those horses. Right now, there are about 32,000 horses out on the range and about 5,800 feral burros, which is about 11,000 over the range capacity. But there's quite a bit of discussion right now in BLM as to what to do with these horses because of funding. They're not able to round up as many as they have in the past. We exported 48,000 horses to Canada to be processed for meat. 110,000 went to Mexico last year, which is the first time that the number going to Mexico has exceeded the number going to Canada. And it's about a 16% increase over 2011, which is a little surprising because honestly, with the decline in breeding, I felt that we'd see a leveling or even a decline in the number of horses processed for meat. And there are a lot of other unwanted horses out there. It's amazing how many horses some of the Native American tribes own. I was at a meeting in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, and one of the tribes there said they had as many as 20,000 horses in their herd. And then what we don't know how many horses are standing out here in the pasture that are neglected or abandoned or ignored because they're too thin to send to the processing plants. So based on our survey, the horse that's most likely to be sold, unwanted horse that is a show or competition horse that didn't do very well, didn't win any ribbons or wasn't fast enough. Primarily quarter horses, paints, and thoroughbreds, but those are the top 3 breeds anyhow, so that makes sense. Tend to be younger horses and about half mares and geldings. The horse most likely to be donated is a race horse, usually thoroughbreds, some quarter horses. These are older horses that have run and then have either had life-threatening or career-ending injuries, and these horses are put into sanctuaries where they're cared for. I used to think it was because the thoroughbred people did a better job of providing funding for their horses that don't do well on the track, but in retrospect, I think it's because a lot of these horses, because they're bred to run and they're pretty high-spirited, can't find second careers like a lot of the horses in the first group. The unwanted horse is most likely to be euthanized as a recreational horse. These are usually second career horses that didn't do well in the show ring but ended up as a kid's horse or a knock-around horse or a trail horse. They tend to be older horses and they tend to be euthanized because of an injury or colic. So that's just a little review on the unwanted horse and what we worked through when we were dealing with the groups that I talked about. So here's what we've learned. And I'm almost embarrassed to show this to you, but this is what we've learned. We've learned that our views on animal welfare are conditioned by our own personal knowledge base and life experience. And when we deal with people on these issues, sometimes it's hard for us to understand why they think that way or where they're coming from. But it's because they were raised differently. They might have been raised in the country or in the city. It's based on their religion. It's based on their parents. It's based on a lot of things that have happened in their life that bring them to a place where they have a view on welfare. And I'll give you a good example. This is my wife, and she's a veterinarian. I was raised in Missouri on a cattle farm where our horses spent their whole life outside. The only time they were in a barn was if they were injured or if it was bad weather and they were foaling. Other than that, they spent their entire life outside. Also, through the years as a veterinarian, most of the colics I have treated have been stalled horses, and it's rare to see a pastured horse colic, so I think that unless they're show horses, you've got to keep them legged up or you've got to keep them up because you're showing them. They need to be outside. My wife was raised in Oklahoma, in town. Her horses spent their life stabled, and they were turned out to exercise or turned out when they were ridden. Other than that, they were stabled. And so my view of good welfare for our horses is that they stay out in the pasture as much as possible. Her view of good welfare is that they be stalled. And so when the weather turns cold, or we get a little cold front comes through, or it starts to snow or rain, she wants the horses in the barn, and I want the horses in the pasture. We've had this discussion forever. And you know where the horses spend their time, don't you? But here are two people that are pretty well educated, that have both been around horses a lot, and we have totally different views on what's good welfare for our horses. And so that's not uncommon, I don't think. And I'm going to prove my point with you all, and I'm going to use chickens because I doubt if there's very many people in here that are in the chicken business. There may be one or two. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that even in a group like this, where people have a fairly similar background, there's going to be a divergent opinion on what's good welfare. So let's talk about laying hens. There's 3 ways that laying hens are managed, either in cages, in laying houses, chicken houses, or free range. And so we're going to compare the 3. And so laying chickens that are raised on laying cages, they live in a space about the size of a piece of paper, about that big. They don't have nesting boxes, and they don't have litter, and they don't have perches. And they like to fluff themselves up in the dust, and they like to sit on perches, but they don't have that. But they have access to food and water. There's not hardly ever aggressive interaction between the chickens. They get along pretty well. There's almost no cannibalism. You can see the birds really easily walking through the chicken house, so if one of them's sick or injured, you can pick them out. And their eggs are protected, and there's almost no disease because their droppings drop through the cage on the ground and are removed immediately. So there's almost no disease. If we look at chickens raised in chicken houses, they're on raised wooden floors, but they can get out and run around and scratch and dust themselves in the litter. There's some aggression and some cannibalism because they fight amongst themselves. They're hard to observe individual chickens, so if you're walking through that group of chickens, it's pretty hard to tell who's sick or injured. There's increased disease risk because they're down where their droppings are, and they're dusting themselves around their droppings, and they lay eggs all over the place. If you look at free-range chickens, they can go outside, they can go inside, they can run around, they can scratch in the dirt, dust themselves. There's a lot of aggression and cannibalism and injuries, and when they collect these birds, there's usually a lot of broken bones and so forth. They're exposed to the elements and pests and predators, and there's an increase of full-born diseases because they're out where the diseases are. So I'm going to ask you to vote, and don't be shy. We're not going to give you a grade or anything. Everybody that thinks that the welfare, the environment that the caged chickens live in is the best welfare for laying hens, raise your hand. Now put them on up, you don't have to be shy. And everybody thinks that laying houses are better welfare. And everybody that thinks that free-range chickens have better welfare. So it was about 20–30% for the caged and maybe 10 for the house and the rest for free range. And so that's my point. We're fairly similar. We have common interests. We have pretty different ideas about what's good welfare. And so why is that? So if we're to think that function's important, if we think that they're healthy and that they're growing and that they're productive, then we're going to say that is the best welfare, that they be caged, because they are healthier and they are more productive and they are growing and doing well. If our main concern is that they're not suffering, that they're content, that they can do the things that they like to do, like dust themselves and have a perch and a nesting box where they can lay eggs, then we're going to select the chickens that are in the housed environment. And if we think that they ought to be able to express species-typical behavior and that they can run around and be a bird and emulate wild birds, then we're going to select the chickens that are free range. And so it's where you come from and how you view things that determines what you think is good welfare and what's not. So our choices are conditioned by our life experiences, but there are a lot of other viewpoints out there. There's other people in the horse industry in different breeds and disciplines. There's people who live in the city. There's animal activists. There's public officials, and they all have a different view of welfare based on their personal experience. So let's talk about animal-related businesses. We here in this room believe that welfare is really important to our horses, but we have production efficiencies. We have to work within certain cost confinements, competitive pressure, return on investment. How do we make money, make a living? Tradition, something that Dr. Hurd talked about earlier. If my dad did it and my grandpa did it, then it must be okay. And that's something we see across agriculture, not just in the horse business. We tend to view animals as instruments for use, for either entertainment or living. and we're viewed by the public as cold or uncaring because we tend to deal in facts or information that we can prove. And they think that that's cold. And that's a very big problem for veterinarians especially, and I've learned, my wife will tell you, I'm probably not real warm and fuzzy sometimes, and I tend to be this way, but when you interact with the public, you interact with the media, and you come across that way, it turns them off because they think you don't care, even though we do. If you look at the public, with urbanization, we've moved from the ranch or farm in town. Animals have moved from utility for food and fiber to companions or part of our family. And so rather than own our dogs and cats, they're our kids. When I grew up, our dogs stayed outside, never came in the house. They lived outside. My dogs live in the house. They sleep on the bed under the covers. So we've come a long way. And that's how folks tend to view them, and that's how a lot of people view horses. And so the American public is a moderate animal rights advocate. That doesn't mean they're an extreme like some of the humane groups that we've talked about. That means that they believe that animals have rights, and animals do have some rights. They have a right to be cared for properly and euthanized humanely if need be, and provided a good place to live. So their vision of good animal welfare is very similar to their own. So when they're driving down the road and they see my horses standing in a foot of snow, and they think, my God, it's cold outside. I would be freezing if I was standing out there. And obviously those horses are cold, and obviously they're mistreating the horses because they view it as what's good for me is good for them. And they want to protect animals, but they don't know what that means. And here's something, you probably have a hard time reading this, but the other day my wife brought home some brown eggs, and they were cage-free eggs, and normally we just buy the cheap white eggs. So these eggs cost $350 or $3.50 a dozen, where the white eggs cost $1.25 a dozen. And it says inside the lid, so I took a picture because I think this is very telling. Thank you for choosing our eggs. These eggs are produced on small Amish Mennonite farm families where the tradition of being a good steward of the land are passed on from generation to generation. In many cases, the eggs are gathered by hand, and much of the family is involved in the care of the birds and the collection of the eggs. You can be assured that the eggs that you're buying come from chickens that are allowed to roam freely about the hen house and are fed a vegetarian diet. Well, if you've been around chickens, you know that chickens are not vegetarians. But this resonates with the public. Small Amish farms, eggs gathered by hand, chickens are allowed to roam freely, and they're fed a vegetarian diet. And that's the type of thing that resonates with the public. Another viewpoint are animal activists. They come from all walks of life. Most are not familiar with the animal care practices or how we take care of horses. Most are driven by a genuine desire to do something good for animals. And you have to separate the people that spend money and send money into these organizations to the 2 or 3 large organizations that are mainly aimed at lobbying Congress and not at helping animals. They tend to use movie stars and 30-second bites to gain the attention of the American public. In order to survive, they have to raise money to support their activities, and so they use commercials like this. And so you can go to any veterinary clinic in America and see dogs and cats that look like that. It doesn't necessarily mean they're being abused. But to the average person, when they see these on TV, they think, I have to do something to help them, and they send in money. And the Humane Society of the United States raises between $160 and $180 million a year based on ads and emotional propaganda like that. Unfortunately, most of it doesn't go toward helping animals. Another view is public officials that come from all walks of life. They're not familiar with animal care, but they need to be reelected and reappointed, and so they're open to tremendous influenced by stakeholders, and that's why it's really important that those of us here in the room that are interested contact our congressmen and senators and talk to them as much as often. We go to Washington, D.C. a couple times a year and meet with them, and it's always interesting. They hear a lot of stuff, and I think they really appreciate someone coming in that actually knows what's going on to give them some advice. Back in the 60s, there was a lady named Ruth Harris that wrote a book in England that was focused on factory farms, or intensive farming, we'd call it today. And this book painted a bleak picture of how animals were treated on these large factory farms, she called it. So the Queen of England was upset, and she appointed a committee to come up with 5, or initially 4, guiding principles that you could measure animal care against and decide whether they have good welfare or bad. And these are not freedoms, these are needs. So they need to have plenty of water and feed, they need to be comfortable, they need to be free from injury or disease, they need to act like their species would normally act, and then a couple years later they added they need to be free from fear and distress. So if we take our chickens again and we look at those 5, nutrition, discomfort, injury, disease, behavior, fear, and distress, and a plus being good welfare and a minus bad, you can see that there's no one setting that has perfect welfare for the birds. Some are good and some are bad. And so it's a complicated issue. Some of the problems we have is we get hung up on one welfare criteria. Back in 2008 in California, folks got together and put Proposition 2 on the ballot. And Proposition 2 prohibited confining animals so that they couldn't turn around, free to lie down, stand up, or fully extend their limbs without touching the wall or another animal. And it was aimed at caged chickens. And so when that passed, they were given a couple of years to close out or change their ways they raised chickens. But if you look at this chart, and I know you can't see it very well, at the top is mortality, death, internal parasites, external parasites, goes right on down, and the bottom 3 are use of nesting boxes, use of perches, and normal species typical behavior. And so because the people that pushed this proposition and the voters of California voted it in were totally focused on behavior, it drove that industry away and over toward non-cage and outdoor chickens, free-range chickens, where most of the disease, mortality, death, parasites, and so forth were much, much worse, although their behavior was better. And so when it's important that when we look at welfare, we look at the whole picture for the animal. We don't just look at one specific thing, because otherwise we may make things worse in another area. So in a perfect world, all welfare decisions are science-based. They're based on what we know, biological function, health, what's normal behavior, and it's based on something that we can prove and demonstrate is true. But in reality, science can only determine what type of risk exists. Society decides what type of level of risk is acceptable. And I think it's interesting if you look at cigarette smoking versus marijuana smoking. The society is pretty clear that smoking is bad for your health, and that's why most cities you can't smoke in public places. But yet we have some states that you can smoke marijuana, even though you're inhaling it just like you would a regular cigarette. But they deem that even though science has determined the risk, they've determined that that's acceptable. The other thing is, if the society perceives that something's wrong, science and logic are unlikely to change that. And when you talk about the unwanted horse issue and the processing of horses for meat, and you walk up the average person and you say, "You think we ought to eat horses?" No. They haven't thought through it. They don't know anything about it. But they think there's something wrong with that. And it's very difficult to work through whether you believe it's good or bad. If you believe it's okay, to work through why it's okay, because it just seems wrong to so many people. And the reason that is they view animal welfare issues as moral issues, not scientific issues. And therefore, when we make decisions regarding animal welfare, We have to do that by balancing our scientific knowledge and our experience and what we know to be true with the ethical and society values. Otherwise, we're in contrast and conflict with them constantly. So how do we do that? Well, I think we have to understand that science informs people, informs decisions, but people make them, and we need to interact with those people. We have to recognize that other people's experience and expectations don't match ours necessarily, and we have to appreciate that differing views are valid. And we have to come to common ground, even though that's very, very difficult sometimes. We have to look at welfare as challenges that are an opportunity to find common ground. And keep in mind that emotion and misinformation will often override science and fact, almost always. Last week I spent an hour and a half on the phone with a newspaper reporter from the East Coast that wanted to talk about the safety of horse meat. And I don't know why he called me, because I don't know a lot about it other than I've been to the plants. And we discussed it for some time. And then he said, "Would you eat horse meat?" And I go, "Well, I have a little bit when I was at the plant." But I said, "Not normally." But I said, "If you believe that beef is safe, and you believe that pork is safe, and you believe that chickens are safe to eat, knowing that at these plants that are under European Union regulations, that horse meat undergoes the same testing for heavy metals, for drugs, for salmonella, for E. coli, for any number of diseases, is stricter than what they do with beef and pork, then you have to assume that horse meat is safe to eat." But when he wrote the article, he completely left out anything that I'd said, because what I said was very factual and unemotional and what I believed, and it wasn't something that was going to fire up his readers and get them all excited. And so it's important to keep in mind that emotion and misinformation will often override science and fact. We have to understand also that we have to communicate with a lot of different people, and some of them we don't like very much. And I know there are a lot of us that have been on panels discussing animal welfare or the unwanted horse or horse slaughter that have had folks at the table that we didn't like at all. But we have to talk to them, because we have to come to common ground. We have to do better than what Congress and the President is doing right now. And here's how not to communicate. In 2006 in Arizona, Proposition 204 was put on the ballot. And Proposition 204 said that you couldn't put sows in gestation crates. And gestation crates are crates that they put these sows in while they're pregnant, that the sows can stand up, walk forward, back, lay down flat. They have food and water, but they can't turn around. And that was put on the ballot. Well, the people in the swine industry spent millions of dollars trying to defeat this ballot. They had done research that shows if you put 100 sows in gestation crates, and after a couple days you open the gates, the sows spend 95% of their time in the gestation crate. And they do that because they have food and water, and they can lie down, and nobody's trying to run them off or fight with them or bite them in the hind end. But they didn't talk about that. The people that were supporting the initiative said, "Animal cruelty, we need to stop animal cruelty," and their response was that it was hogwash. They made no effort to explain what they knew and why they do it. And I think that's a good lesson to take and learn. One of my favorite philosophers, Will Rogers, and he said that everybody is ignorant only on different subjects. And that's sure the case when it comes to horse welfare, and it's sure the case when it comes to the public, and often to federal officials, and often to some of the animal activists. So it's important. What we've done as an industry traditionally is when something comes up that's a little bit controversial, we tend to back up and duck down a little bit and hope that it goes away, and we don't have to get involved. But we need to change that. We need to become the focal point for all equine welfare information. When a news reporter or news magazine reporter is looking for information on welfare, they need to be coming to us, not to an animal activist group. We have to continually work to improve the use and well-being of our horses, And instead of saying we've always done it this way, what's wrong with it, we need to examine why do we do it this way. And I am really proud of AQHA for this Welfare Commission where we're actually doing that. We're actually looking at things and saying, so why are we doing it this way? And I really enjoy serving on that committee with the good discussion that we have. Another quote I like is, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And so if we're not prepared to change the way we do things, we will become irrelevant, and someone else will step in our place, like I showed you in the first couple of slides, and become the voice of authority for how we care for our horses. So it's important that we explain why current approaches are best if we have information to prove it, and we need to make changes, even hard changes, when they're indicated. And then we need to tell our story, because if we don't, someone else will, and we may not like what they have to say. So thank you.